Welcome to all of you. And as Sumitra said, this is the first of the PRIA Logues, in which David Brown and Rajesh Tandon will be sharing their experience so that hopefully it can inform the work that you do now going into the future in some important ways. Let me introduce David Brown, who's known to many people at PRIA. He is currently, most recently I should say, not currently, he's retired, even though neither of us can quite believe it. He has served as a senior research fellow at the Hauser Center on Nonprofit Organizations, focusing on international nonprofits at the Kennedy School at Harvard University in Boston. He was the founder and president of the Institute for Development Research from the early 1980s till after the turn of the century. Dr. Rajesh Tandon, who is known internationally very well, is an acclaimed leader and practitioner of participatory research and development. Founded the Society for Participatory Research in Asia in the early 80s and has continued to serve as its leader and guru, if you don't mind my saying that, for these many years. He's recently been appointed as the co-chair of the prestigious UNESCO Chair on Community-Based Research and the Social Responsibility in Higher Education. Thank you all for returning promptly. We will resume the conversation between the doctors Rajesh Tandon and David Brown and shift our focus a bit now to the future. And I'm going to incorporate the questions that we've received into the two broad questions that are designed to guide this conversation. And the first direction we'll take is to ask them both to talk about how the shifting trends of globalization, international cooperation are shaping the networks of civil society since the beginning of the 21st century. 14 years into the 21st century now, so a lot has happened. So if you would begin to do that, and in the course of that, we'll come to talking about the future challenges for institutional and human resource development for CBOs, for civil society, in this emerging context. And there's a question particularly about, in a scenario where increasing competition from the private sector, the consultancies and so on, what are the capacities do CSOs need to have to work with in the context of development? And that I would ask you to hold sort of will be a bridge to our next conversation about current capacity. And I think I just asked you the wrong questions. Excuse me. Forget what I said. What are the crossroads today? And what do you see as the trends influencing the networks of civil society in the 21st century? Pardon me for that digression.
Well, there are a lot. I think that the next couple of decades are going to see a lot of consequences of climate change, and a lot of efforts to do something about it. I think that changing circumstances of the globe are going to make it more likely that we have major crises around food and water and energy. I think there's a process of power diffusion going on in the international arena that's leveling the playing field, and we're going to see less of the U.S. being as dominant as it's been, and much more rise of China and India and the BRICS and so on. And I think the consequences of the information revolution are going to change the sort of possibilities for individuals and for sort of flash movements around the world. So I think there are going to be a lot of uncertainties. And at the very minimum, it means that what we know now as civil society organizations is not going to be enough. We're going to have to be inventive and think more about how to deal with the kinds of operating in an increasingly globalized and interdependent world. I worry particularly about the United States succumbing to the fantasy that they could build a wall around the country and be safe, and that they don't. I think the consequences of not paying attention to the problems the globe faces and not working to solve them are going to be catastrophic. So, I think the crossroads are legion. The kinds of roles that civil society can play. Well, let me just suggest three as a start. One is, I think, for those of you who participated in the workshop the other day, one of the roles of civil society is to articulate values and to do value creation and synthesis that is compelling for large swatches of the population. And so I think looking at the emerging challenges and articulating widely acceptable or widely compelling values for how we should respond to them is going to be an important creative role for civil society. And it's most likely that civil society will do it because for various reasons they're not stuck in one national context. Governments by definition have to deal with their citizens, not with the global situation. And corporations in the business sector is too focused on the making a buck, basically. So that's going to, value synthesis is going to be an important role for civil society. I think being a catalyst for cooperative problem solving, being an activist mediator in the language of yesterday or in various other ways, being a trusted resource that can bring together lots of different stakeholders is the second major possibility. And the third is just being a catalyst for innovation, for not being stuck in the way we've always done things. Because I think we know that the way we've always done things is not going to be enough. That we're facing unprecedented problems, that we're going to need unprecedented solutions. And so being able to step outside of the way things have always been is going to be very, very important.
Rajesh, for you, the shifting transit globalization, international cooperation, crossroads, and what is the shape that civil society might take going forward?
I think increasingly the language of civil society will disappear. You know, when Civicus was founded in 1993, and some of us were involved in producing a sort of a status report before the first General Assembly of Civicus in January '95 in Mexico City. We titled that book Citizens, Strengthening Global Civil Society. But the main focus was on citizens. That may have been aspirational in 1994. But I think in 2014, 20 years hence, we are already living in an era of global citizens, largely enabled by information technology, mobile technology revolution. So I see more and more questions of citizenship, of civic engagement, civic action, citizen leadership as ways of moving forward in thinking about how challenges facing societies will be addressed. And that formulation, in my view, allows much easier ways of cooperation cross the boundaries of organizational sectors, because those boundaries will remain, but people will be moving around. And to some extent, the dot-com revolution and those campaigns are already witness to that. When you launch a dot-com campaign or a digital campaign, you're not limiting yourself to only those who work in civil society organizations. So civil society organization as a formulation, I think, has more or less outlived its utility. The crossroad is essentially going to be around facing from where I sit, from where I look, facing the challenge of huge mixing of populations. Call it migration, rural-urban migration, intercontinental, intercountry immigration. But even within the country's boundaries, there's a lot of shuffling of populations that is already happening, it's going to grow. And in that milieu of shifting populations, of meeting people dissimilar to yourself, how do you deal with the notions of common, shared public values and goods? That's one big, I think, role I see. More importantly than dealing with even the government or the private sector is the role of citizenship in generating a new, coherent societal ethos of shared values and public goods. And the second challenge is, of course, 20 years hence, men will be marginal. They are beginning to be already, and will be more marginal. And elderly will be found in elderly homes, even in this country. So the young are globally connected, but not necessarily historically rooted. So you can horizontally be globally connected today, not necessarily temporally historically rooted. So how do we bring questions of coherent, shared values, things like gender equity, social justice, those concepts need to be reframed, re-articulated, in fact, freshly discussed with the shifting milieu of migrants, shuffling of populations and the young. And this is where I see the role of citizen leadership. Organized forms like PRIAs of this world can enable that process, or they would become relics of the past. In the changing scenario of development assistance, I think we are done. ODA, official development assistance, as we knew in the 80s and 90s, is gone, more or less gone. Back to linking economic interests with social investment. And this is not just OECD, but this is as much China, Brazil, India, Russia as anybody else. So we are going to be facing this new reality, already facing, without adequate preparation. So I see the current phase is similar to the early 90s. We are in search of a new identity. If citizen leadership, citizen action across various institutional boundaries, overcoming boundaries, is going to be the key force moving forward, then what's the role of institutions like PRIA? What's our identity? And in supporting the capacities of those citizen leadership, what's our material base going to be? Where are we going to find resources to make that happen? it's not an easy question. The answer is not in CSR or private foundation or whatever. But I think we are, in that sense, at an era of reclaiming our identity or redefining our identity as institutions.
So one of my reactions to the question here was, what is the future of development, capacity building for development NGOs? And I'm not sure what that future is, but I will bet
That is future.
Yeah, no, probably not worth investing a whole lot of your life in worrying about that, as opposed to what is capacity building for social justice going to look like. Because social justice is a problem that's probably not going to go away soon. And just to touch on one area where I'm pretty sure that there's going to be work to be done. What seems to be emerging about the distribution of wealth in the world is that it's increasingly concentrated at the very, very top. And that's true globally, and it's even more true in countries like the US, which, in spite of our long-held talk and worship of social mobility, we are now last in the industrialized world in the capacity for somebody who's born to a poor family to become wealthy. So I think there's going to be a lot of concern about how to deal with this ever-growing disparity between the rich and the poor. I think it's going to interact in some difficult ways with the demographics of the emerging world. So one of the things that's going on in the US, and I suspect here as well, is we're getting a bigger chunk of old folks. We're living longer, you're going to have to deal with this for even further. And that's matched in some countries by a youth bubble. And in some countries by a youth bubble that's mostly young men who may not have very good prospects as the wealth gets concentrated at the top. So they're going to be an explosive force, as we can already see in some African countries and some Asian countries. I think that while development NGOs may not be the future, and certainly funding for development NGOs is not the place where you want to hang your hat, the challenges of social justice are going to continue, and thinking about innovative ways of responding to that may be a new growth area. And I suspect the people who find ways to respond effectively to that are going to be able to generate support to do it.
In I like the way you put it, capacity building for social justice. In putting it that way, my sense is that commitment to social justice is no longer limited to civil society organizations. There are lots of folks out there, in government, in private business, in media, who have a commitment to social justice. They may not know how to act on their commitment. Some of them act on their commitment by making a monthly check. But there is more that could be done. So in a way, by overcoming the self-imposed boundaries around our sectoral identities, if we reach out. So in a way, capacity building for citizen leadership or capacity building for social justice may include folks who we have not worked together before, who don't come from civil society organizations or any of those lineages, who may be working in mining company or pharmaceutical or law ministry or wherever. And that kind of an in-situ shuffling of dissimilar others. And I don't know if we have the methodology for that. If we have, because our methodology of capacity building sort of came from individual and group learning, used the organizational and inter-organizational framework, but still contained the organizational boundaries and frameworks. So cooperation, inter-organizational, and I think we're going to enter a new era of building networks of active citizens for social justice, irrespective of where they are located and how they earn their livelihood. And in that formulation, I think building those networks locally, at the level of a small town, at the level of a block, is going to be an important contribution. It's not just networks of folks who hang around in Delhi or Boston, or live in Delhi and Boston because they are networked, but it's creating those networks, networked local network at the level of a small town, at the level of neighborhoods, at the level where you don't say that you work in the government and you work in the private sector. I am the one who works in civil society.
Yeah. So could you speak to that? What do you see as the emerging issues bringing people from different walks of life together as citizen activists and citizen leaders? Are there any others that you see as being big in the next spot?
I think we can identify sort of general areas where there are going to be challenges. So, for instance, what do you do when a typhoon arrives and levels the community? As we know happens in Orissa every so often. How do you respond to that? And what are ways to build capacity in the community to deal with these kinds of unprecedented challenges? And one of the things I thought about is, I wonder if the strategy that we used at IDR might be helpful to those of you who are trying to figure out what you want to do next. Because we ended up sort of saying, well, what are we interested, who are we interested in working with? Who would be exciting to work with? And then we went out and found some organizations that looked exciting to us and tried to understand them in terms that meant we could provide some support to their work. So, finding examples of good community response to catastrophic events and looking at several of those and beginning to identify principles for getting ready for catastrophic events or for responding to them as they come along might be a way of building yourself a technology for doing what you want to do.
You're basically saying new knowledge building out of the citizen activity that addresses emerging
That seems to be effective in responding to the kinds of social justice issues that you're interested in.
One question you posed was, what would I have done if I graduated from college today? I certainly wouldn't have imagined setting a PRIA. But I would have been less conflicted about the possibility of working towards social justice agenda than I was 40 years ago. The reason is that in this society, the sectoral boundaries were very rigid. You were either this camp or you were that camp. We are now going to enter, already have entered in some parts, we're entering an era where there is greater fluidity of movement of people and practices across various types of institutions. However, that fluidity is not yet happening at the local level, at the level of small towns, at the level of blocks. It is happening at a sort of somewhat meso-macro level. And this is where, I think new ways of having a conversation, which is building mutual capacity And accountability to mutual commitment is going to be important going forward. Because irrespective of which neighborhood you live in, you're going to face the issue of shuffling of populations and contestation around what's a shared public good. That contestation needs to be addressed in some way locally as well. And that's where networked action by a group of citizens at the local level in order to arrive at a consensus and also articulate that consensus of what's a shared value, shared social justice concerns may be there, but may not just be articulated adequately. So that's where, a much more spaces for, public spaces for conversations, for engagement, we need to reclaim. And those public spaces have now become highly ritualized in this country. You put up a banner, you put garlands, microphones, and only then you can have a conversation. But public sphere needs to be reclaimed in ways that you can have a conversation without the rituals and the paraphernalia.
Potentially broaden the
Yeah.
inclusion of people in that conversation.
Absolutely.
Because that's not what they do. David, thoughts from you?
Yeah,
You
I was-
start again. Yeah.
Well, two sets of things. One is I was thinking, Rajesh, as you talked about the rigid boundaries when you were a student. That was both confining and reassuring for the people who stayed within the boundaries. Now,
Yeah, you knew where you stood,
yeah.
but there was no ambiguity.
And I think you and I both had careers that had a lot of detours from the standard path for whatever bizarre psychological quirks were motivating us. And I think in a world with less boundaries like that, it can be more anxiety provoking because you know what you ought to be doing or what the path should look like. You have to invent it from the beginning. The public spaces. We live in a town that has 5,000 venues. And one of the interesting things about the town is if I have a heart attack, the people who will come to get me and take me to the hospital are volunteers. And if our house catches on fire, it's the volunteer fire department that's going to come and spray it. And so this is a community that is partly organized around volunteer commitments of its members. And we're discussing now about the possibility of creating a network that will allow older people to stay in their homes rather than to move into a facility of some sort. Because lots of people would much rather stay at home, but they need to have somebody stop by every so often to find out whether they've fallen down and can't get up. So Jade and I have decided we're not going to be volunteer fire people, but we might get involved in this network. And Jane is already the czar of community gardens in the town. And I work on the board of the local land trust. So there may be a lot of things that you can do thinking about the community you live in and how you might get active about making it a place that's worth living in.
I like your point, Dave, about we knew where our place was, and that was a sense of security. You know how to deal with it. And increasingly, we are in an uncertain, sort of fluid environment. So, individuals may know how to cope with uncertainty, but organizations are, by nature, sort of laggards in that respect. And perhaps this is an area I was thinking after listening to you. We may consider how do you shape your organizational functioning in an era of uncertainty. Look at the issue of social media. Yes, we have a hashtag PRIA, but everybody in PRIA has their own hashtag as well. Now, how these multiple hashtags tag along? Or will they be separate words? I will do hashtag to my friends from my ID, and all the sort of boring and sort of difficult and complicated stuff I'll put on Priya's hashtag. But I see the possibility that if all these hashtags interact, then Priya will be able to be a far more responsive, coping with uncertainty, more fluid, more flexible, more agile institution, redefining its identity as it moves along.
So I think there's an ongoing temptation in this world, a tension between agility and connectedness, and the energy that takes, and the desire to build a wall and stay safe and not have to move all the time. The sort of information equivalent of a couch potato.
Yeah, but it's sort of, in practical terms, in the early era, we used to do strategic planning for 3 to 5 years. That time frame is irrelevant. So maybe the phrase is not strategic planning, but strategizing, strategically thinking, and doing it every day, as opposed to once in 5 years. So, capacity to do that, capacity to be able to move in a focused way, and yet be agile, yet be, and many development organizations are torn at the moment. I think this is where the challenge for at least in the near future is. We need digital connectivity, but not at the cost of human connectivity. So how do you carry them all together? So we need organizational focus, but not focused rigidity. We need mobility, agility, flexibility, responsiveness to remain relevant for the work we do, for capacities we build. So not just focusing on capacity building of NGOs, but also capacity building of local government leaders, capacity building of people working in the private sector. It doesn't matter, because it's
capacity building for society.
Yeah, societal capacity, and increasingly capacity to develop, shared values and shared consensus on public goods, and how do we work towards that? I think that's the sort of the challenge. Good question.
And I'm looking forward to hearing the answers that are going to get constructed by some of the people listening. Because I think we've had our chance to do a lot of the constructing that we're going to do.
Good. Well, thank you both very much for this interesting and always reinforcing dialogue between the two of you. I hope that some of the issues and questions that you all have were addressed, or at least sparked by the conversation, and that you all will continue with these sorts of questions as you go into the future, particularly with PRIA's activities. So thank you very much for joining us.